And I'll do the same. So Canada is an immense country that is west of Europe, and there are 35 million people in Canada. We would not even be one of the top 10 most populous countries in Africa if we were located there. The 35 million people in Canada don't make nearly as many inventions and don't have nearly as big a market as the United States and Europe and many other places. So for Canadian inventors, often the biggest market is the US, and then they look to Europe, and then they look to other places, increasingly to Asia and also to Africa, in particular to South Africa, actually. So our law is the same. We don't get many cases. Most of the cases heard in the Canadian courts and relating to patents relate to pharmaceuticals and not to computer-implemented inventions. But there has been some consistency between the courts through the years. Long before I got into this business in 1981, there was a case in which the court, is a lengthy case related to oil exploration and mining, and the court said the computers are not relevant to patentability. You ignore the computer and look to the rest of the invention, the rest of the document, the rest of the claims to determine if there's an invention there. And they've been relatively consistent throughout. There's been a fair bit of consistency in Canadian practice. And the trend has generally been to follow European case law in some areas and US case law in other areas, often with a mix that's not ideal, but this general principle has stayed the same. By the time I got into this business around 2000, we were regularly getting patents for inventions by using those computer storage medium type claims and other claims, as was happening in the US. A few years ago, the Amazon one-click case, which was litigated partway through in the US and then settled, it was litigated all the way through the Court of Appeal in Canada. And this was a bit of a watershed moment where the trial court actually said business methods are patentable in Canada. There was an actual sentence that effectively says that in a decision. The Court of Appeal generally agreed, and since then, this has been the leading case in the area in Canada. Unfortunately, the Patent Office doesn't read the Canadian cases the same way that the patent bar does, and maybe the judges do at times. So what the courts say is that there is a requirement that there be a physical element, that the claims be given a purposive construction in determining whether there's a physical element or whether, these are actually out of order, there should be a physical element or there should be a material effect. This is very similar, if you're familiar with US case law, this is very similar to the machine or transformation test that's existed for a long time in US doctrine, and that was restated in the Mayo case a while ago. And the purpose of construction concept is taken from the United Kingdom case law about, it's almost 20 years ago, over 20 years ago now. And it was adopted in Canada around 1999, 2000, with the idea that you look to the claim to see what was intended to be protected and then determine whether the prior art shows that, using the specific language of the claims to determine what the inventor intended. The case law in Canada has focused on the claims as defining the invention. I think that's the applicable standard everywhere. Certainly that is how, and like I said, as a Canadian, we tend to look at a lot of US issues because our clients consider that very important, and look at a lot of European issues and keep on top of those because that's probably the second biggest market that we have. The Patent Office takes a lot of different views. They issue on a regular basis, every 2 or 3 years, new guidelines relating to different subject areas, and the current guidelines relating to computer-implemented inventions have been in place for about 2 years, I think. There was one set issued, and they were rejected largely by the profession, and they were revised. The current approach that they take is, one of them is called the essential elements approach. They look at a claim and they discard everything from it that they consider to be not essential to the invention. And this comes from that purposive construction, if for anyone who's from Britain, the Katnick case, Katnick versus Hill in the late 1990s, the idea of defining what is essential and what is non-essential. In that case, and in the Free World Trust case in 1999 that adopted the law in Canada, the point was to say that everything set out in a claim is essential, unless the inventors made it clear within the document that it's not essential. The point being, hey, it's essential if it's not in the infringing article, well, you don't have an infringement. The doctrine was intended to narrow the scope of a claim. The Canadian Patent Office has turned it on its head in the last couple of years and said that something is only essential if it is physical. When they're looking at computer-implemented inventions, it has, as an element in and of itself, a technical character. And they're starting to draw in language from the United States and from Europe and applying it to individual claim elements and excluding pretty much in every case the computer component, the hardware components of the claim, which then leaves a method of steps, and then they describe that as being too abstract to patent. The other thing that they do, and I think, I'm not very familiar with European law, but I think to some extent this is a bit European, the idea of looking at the entire document and determining what is the problem to be solved here, and then looking at the claim to say, well, what is the solution? And this sort of problem-solution concept, which is not, again, not supported by Canadian case law. They're looking to the document as a whole rather than to the claims. So while our case law has been generally positive when it comes to computer-implemented inventions, there have been relatively few cases, and the approach taken by the Patent Office is sometimes a little difficult. On the plus side with the Patent Office, and what I'm trying not to, I knew I would be going fairly late in this, and I didn't want to put in all of the doctrine topics that were going to be discussed. The discussion in the case law and in our responses and exchange with the Patent Office are often very similar to what's already been discussed. That if you can demonstrate a technical character, and I prefer the European language rather than the American language because the examiners seem to accept it better. But if you can demonstrate a technical character of the invention as defined by the claim as a whole, you generally do well. And the examiners are cooperative, so they follow their process, they follow their administrative process, and then they become more cooperative on the first action. And we find that most subject matter issues can be resolved on the first action. My own view on this is that all of these patent offices have it wrong, that they should not be looking at this as a subject matter issue, that these are largely obviousness issues. And yes, many of the applications filed are describing the automation of a known process or the automation of a process that is an intellectual process and maybe shouldn't be patentable, but it should not be patentable largely because it's obvious, not because it is not a machine or does not transform a product or make does not have a technical result. So usually, if you don't say those words but you lead them down that path, Canadian patent examiners will get there with you. The decisions that they make can be appealed, and we don't, as I said, have a lot of court decisions, but we do have regular appeals to the Patent Appeal Board, which is an internal body within the Patent Office, typically formed of 3 senior patent examiners, not including the examiner that you dealt with originally. The decisions of the Patent Appeal Board can then be appealed to the Federal Court of Canada, and then that moves up through the appeal process to the Supreme Court if it gets there. The Amazon case came to the courts in that manner. It was refused by the examiner, refused by the appeal board, and then allowed in the federal court at both the trial and the appeal levels. So I have some examples of cases that have been refused by the Patent Appeal Board, and I haven't set out the claims here to avoid the arcana of that, but each of these systems, when you dig into them, were defined as essentially an intellectual process. I have obtained claims for neural network models in Canada. It is possible you have to focus on the technical side and the machine side and the implementation rather than on the algorithmic and mathematical side. Neural nets are often, the invention is often quite algorithmic and procedural, but the implementation and then the use of the implemented system is often quite protectable. Methods of playing poker, well, methods of playing games are essentially not patentable in Canada. The kits and the systems that are used to play games can be, but this decision, it came down largely on the basis of it's an electronic implementation of something that is otherwise not patentable, and I think it's a proper and it's a good decision. And similarly, a method for implementing a trading system. Well, the trading system is also a method that's not patentable in Canada per se. So the Patent Appeal Board has generally, I think, found a reasonable basis once they've looked at an invention to say, well, the underlying product was not patentable. The reasoning hasn't always been to my satisfaction. The reasoning is often to declare things as abstract, to make this essential, non-essential analysis, but the results have generally been fairly reasonable. Some of the things that have been accepted in the last few years by the Appeal Board, So here's an electronic commerce case that really detailed, and they got into a lot of specific detail about the interrelationship between different computing systems and the communication between them. And that, like some of the other speakers have said, if you focus on the technical side in your applications that are then filed in Canada, you will generally do much better than if you focus on the algorithmic or the computing aspect of it per se. The second example there, the classifying of plant embryos, there are a lot of, most of the litigation in Canada relates to patent litigation that goes to trial, relates to life sciences and to pharmaceuticals. And the reason is that Canada has a very healthy generic industry. Canada is also a fairly wealthy country, so the sale of pharmaceuticals is very large there. And so it's worth fighting about, and the parties will fight, and the generics will generally not settle anything unless they're settling in their own favor. So those cases will tend to make it through the courts. Just for some numbers, we have about 120 cases annually filed in Canada. A significant number of them actually do relate to high-tech, mechanical, oil and gas. Oil and gas is a very large industry in Canada. There's a lot of innovation in the high-tech space in Canada, and a few pockets in the Toronto area and a few other areas. Almost all of those cases settle. And so you'll get one or two trials in those areas, and then a few cases relating to pharmaceuticals, often relating to the right to sell medicines. This case of classifying plant embryos was accepted. And again, it's a case that relates to genetic information and relates to just mathematical classification based on that information, yet it was accepted because there was a focus on the technical aspect of the analysis and the results. And schemes for insurance are generally not patentable in Canada. This one was accepted again because of the description of the sensors that are used to gather data and the presentation of that, the gathering of the data and its relationship to the physical events and the driving characteristics that a person engages in that are being sensed with that data gathering. So ultimately, in all of these cases, the use of a computer or the computer itself was found to be essential to being able to carry out the steps of the method or essential to the system that implements that method. And those things were found to be protectable at the Patent Appeal Board. I would say that given the history of the Patent Appeal Board and its relationship with the federal court, that pretty much anything that is patentable at the Patent Appeal Board will survive in the courts. The courts are generally more generous and more protective than the Patent Office itself, including at that appeal level. So the guidance here is very, very similar to what you've already heard, so I won't repeat it in a lot of detail. But physical elements and something that manifests a clear, discernible change. The change can be in data that is clearly a measurement or corresponds to an effect on a physical object. That's ideal. It can be in data per se, as long as you can correlate it back to some behavior or some other transformation. But it gets a little grayer as you get closer to just data per se. What I would say is that in general, any case that succeeds in Europe will have enough technical character to succeed in Canada, and any US case that succeeds post-Alice will be patentable in Canada. The claims may have to be adjusted to meet our law, and that's often in the favor of the applicant. Our laws are quite a bit more flexible when it comes to amendment of cases. One way that we have put it internally when people are studying for a patent agent's exam is to say that the subject matter requirement is similar to Europe, but the prosecution process itself is similar to the United States. And so in a way you have the best of both worlds. You can claim more, both in terms of what is supported by your application, and you can amend quite readily. You can amend your claims as much as you want with hardly ever getting an objection that the claim amendment is not supported by the subject matter of the application as filed. When we do get objections relating to subject matter and relating to obviousness, often it's enough to assert the physical steps. However, if there is no physical description, the description of any physical element, then we do run into trouble. And then we get into this debate with the examiner about, well, what is the problem to be solved? And in cases that are ultimately refused, often it's because there's no clear problem to be solved that has any technical character. There's no description